This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
For the past few weeks, we've been discussing issues related to the socio-economic influences driving crime. An economic model proposed by researchers at the Sol Plaaitjie University explores how South Africa could benefit from radically reducing poverty and inequality. Social grants are already key tools in fighting poverty, but what happens when we go further and stimulate a country with just 5% extreme poverty? Researchers combined macroeconomic and micro-simulation models to test policy options, including budget-neutral social transfers, whatever that means. We'll ask our guest to explain. The findings appear to suggest that targeted grants tied to economic participation could grow GDP and limit inflation while lifting 25 million people from deep poverty. South Africa's to unpack this now further, we are joined by the African Centre for Excellence at the African Centre for Excellence for Inequality Research at the University of Cape Town, Fabio, Andrés, Diaz, Pabón on the line with us. A very good morning and welcome.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you for being with us. Let's start by trying to establish what are the drivers and the causes perhaps of poverty, because one could argue that there are historical legacy issues at play in apartheid, legacies in apartheid spatial design and keeping a particular racial grouping out of the economic spheres of the affairs, the economic affairs of the country for the longest time, and 30 years since that very long period of exclusion. It's still very little time to be able to dramatically and drastically turn things around. But we do now see emerging new generations of young people that are finding themselves, of course, entrenched in this poverty, and a lot of levers that are being pressed on to make people poverty, insecure. And so let's try, maybe before we get to what exactly the model is and the way it proposes to respond to it, how do we understand the nexus problem here?
Well, I think usually when people try to describe poverty, they see it as explaining everything. But the reality is poverty is not disconnected from inequality, right? So the reality is that if one is poor, it's because one had less access to opportunities and resources to be able to afford a livelihood, right? So, for example, if I'm a Black South African that was in a Bantustan, the access of education that I had, the access to public services that I had, limited my possibility to benefit from the opportunities that life could bring to me, right? As opposed as if I'm living in a different area that was not segregated with good schools. So in general, the discussion about poverty and inequality relies on the effect on how inequality is actually limiting people's possibilities and opportunities to benefit and do their own livelihoods, right?
It's I mean that I think is one way certainly to look at it, because one of the things that I often compare it to is that if you take that same kid or that same family and give them opportunity, put them in a relatively safe suburb, where they have, proper education that isn't burdened with high classroom numbers. You have, a stable family with a marginal but stable income, that the prospect of the other consequences of this lifestyle, we've been reflecting a lot about gangsterism and drugs and all of these other social ills, that does the evidence overwhelmingly point to the person with that level of access, in terms of where they fall on the inequality scale, that they have a much better life, that they're much likely to be afflicted by some of these social scourges that we're now responding to.
Yeah, you are totally right. In general, the issue about context and how context is limiting people's possibilities and opportunities related to gangsterism, related to unemployment, related to crime, it speaks about poverty, but also speaks about the necessity of a state to do their work, right? So the state, by definition, is an enabler of what a society can achieve. So a state that allows people to have access to good education, to good health, to good transportation, so you can go to work and arrive at work on time, is a necessary condition to enable people to break all these barriers that exist already, right? And in a country like South Africa, where these barriers were like physical, colored, and ingrained in society, is a little bit harder. And that claims and that actually in fact position the necessity of the state to change those things more clearly. Because in South Africa, this is a product of what the model of society that apartheid tried to instill in society. So how you change that means a lot of work from the state and a lot of like work doing their work, not just burning the money.
Yeah, and if there isn't then, access to a proper school with proper resources in a generally relatively safe community, with access to resources, that, there isn't quite a wand that one can, flick to be able to change things up, in a very miraculous way. And so the one way in which government can contemplate, as you say, as an enabler of economic activity, an enabler of people living better lives, is by means of a social grant. And these researchers and economists at the Sol Plaaitjie University say that the GDP can grow faster, if it is, of course, grants are tied to economic participation. What is meant by grants tying to economic participation?
The idea that like grants attached to economic participation is like the idea that grants can enable people to be part and benefit from the economy. So it's not the idea just that you come and have money and then you spend it, but that actually that enables you to become part of the economy, saying like a small stall, saying some food cooks, like selling, like getting a business that you can create economy in that sense. You know what I mean? And that enables you to say like, okay, I'm going to get my kid to school and I'm going to buy her new notebook so she can go to school, or just trying to improve her schooling attainment. That those things in which the grants actually help people to jump those barriers, because the grants have been great in South Africa in allowing people not to starve, but they haven't been like that capable of breaking those barriers yet. The grants have been incredible, slowing down the growth of inequality, but they haven't been that capable of breaking inequality itself.
Okay, and I want to come a little bit later to how to sustain a social grant beneficiary system, when, the tax base, and look, I mean, everybody pays taxes in some degree, but the base that government relies on to generate revenue seems to be shrinking, at least what some data seem to suggest, and I'll come to that in just a bit. But first, let's pick up on that idea that you have grants that are tied to economic participation. There was this social relief of distress grant for individuals that do not have any sort of income. The president, during a State of a Nation address on at least 2 to 3 years back, was celebrating how some people had used 350 rand, saved up several 350 rands to be able to start a business, and they then now are in the swing of owning and running their own business. For others, there's not quite that patience, because 350 rand with no income anywhere else, and hunger being a very real challenge for them, it's about survival. And so when we talk about grants that are conditional to economic development, what form and shape does that grant take? Because even SRD at the moment, I understand, is woefully falling short.
Yeah, I think like there's different issues there in what you mentioned, rightly so. And one is like the economy is not doing that well, so it's hard to imagine how we can use the money in a way we can trigger development and allow people to try to find their own opportunities, right? What you were saying about the 350 rand social distress grant, but also like the fact that not everyone can make magic with 350 rands because people is starving. So first, we need to lift up people to the point where they don't need to depend on these grants just to survive, and then they can use it as an action, right? So it's the idea of like the state as an enabler of businesses, and it can be big businesses and small businesses, but it's the importance of how to allow people to create businesses because in the long term that allows to have more money in the economy, that allows to increase the tax base, and that makes it sustainable. That's the idea of these principles, right? The question then is, how do we manage to do that in a context that has so many barriers that are visible and invisible, right? So if you attend school X, the likelihood that you will get like an income is 50%, but if you attend a different school, it changes your likelihood, your life opportunities, right? So how do we transform that? And the reality, and this is kind of like something that we need to be honest, is there's no easy fixes. This means a lot of work. People devoted almost 50 years to install apartheid in this country. So we're not gonna like fix it just like in 3 or 4 years. It requires transgenerational commitment. So we and our grandchildren are committed to create a more equal society because that's the one they're gonna live and our future is gonna enjoy.
Yeah, and we then also risk, if doing nothing about it, social upheaval in the form of riots that we've seen previously in this country, and much like what we see in Indonesia at the moment, where deep poverty and inequality has led to a rebellion of some sort. When politicians continue to benefit at the expense of the local economy. And so those are very real risk factors for us to consider. Let's try and unpack now the issue around existing public funds to support poverty alleviation. Aside from the 350 Rand and aside from the other cohorts of social grants that exist, the government has been on an austerity drive. They've cut back education budgets, they've cut back on health budgets, even though they want to establish an NHI, for instance, that would have to have a funding base, and there's question marks about that and how that could possibly work. But we sit with a very real conundrum here in that the pattern of Treasury and of the government has been to cut back on public spending, and I wonder how impactful that is likely to be.
Well, it can be tragic in the sense that it depends on the kind of public spending that you cut. If you're cutting on the blue light brigade, that hasn't happened yet, the impact is not going to be felt. A minister can get to their work on time. But if you're talking about the 350 rands that someone needed to feed their kids, how can you talk about being legitimate as a state when that's your priority? So I think there's something that is important when we talk about finances and economics. And it's not only the allocation of money and this idea of austerity, but also the kind of example and the legitimacy that you do in these processes. So if the government is saying, let's stop the crazy spending, stop where the crazy spending is actually taking place. And that's not keeping people's livelihoods. That is all this sumptuous spending when people go on government budget on first class flights. That's the way you signal that you want to care about your society and that you're trying to lead by example. Otherwise, you get in a situation where you're basically squeezing people to the right corner of the side, and then you say why there was a riot? I mean, the thing of Indonesia, we saw it just now. And that happened across the world during the pandemic, when there were riots all over the place, because people that is in the lower end of the income are feeling ignored and belittled by their governments, while people is actually making money. So it's an issue of legitimacy and the way you do legitimacy. And austerity is not the way to do this. Responsibility, it is a way of doing it, but not austerity.
How different is the South African economic design, in terms of ordinary folk? Just this morning, we have such a bouquet of issues that we are highlighting, and one of them this morning was around municipal costs that are ever so much increasing. You have, as a mechanism of testing, of course, economic performance on a quarterly basis, when the inflation numbers get released and so on and so forth. One of the biggest drivers for inflation at times would be, the rising costs of electricity and municipal costs in particular. And we've seen how some municipalities are struggling, largely where there is a very low income yield, on the part of some communities, etc. And given this scenario that I'm sketching at the moment, I wonder whether our current thinking around inflation targeting is not adequate, but whether it is designed in a way to truly speak to how to make people's lives better. And the reason why I cite this is because this is the mechanism that the Reserve Bank uses to decide, for instance, interest rates. And many occasions we have a highly indebted society and very vulnerable poor people that take out short-term loans with high interest rates, etc., with very little protection for them. And so they remain in a cycle of capital exploitation. And so from a government perspective, while we've covered the area of austerity, we've looked at how, grants can play some sort of a stimulus role in the economy, it is though still hindered by the broader architectural design of this economy, which, again, I'm not certain whether, it is sustainable given the fact that more and more people are getting poor.
Well, you're totally right. This is not sustainable for anyone. There's no way we can have a society in which if I'm a high earner, I can feel safe when everyone else is suffering. And if I'm a low income earner, I'm going to feel safe because I'm basically starving. So I think part of the issue is that when we have, like, by definition, the case of South Africa is like a society that was built with the idea of difference and inequality by design. And that's one of the tricky things in the South African economy because, if there was a World Cup of inequality, South Africa would be winning it, unfortunately. And that is not good in the sense that, like, that has been built into the society. The question is how you change that. And one of the ways in which we can think about is how do we think about inflation that actually affects the people that are so unequal that are basically start to get 10 rands more to buy cereal or millipap, right? So I think in that sense, the issue with inflation and how governments work is a little bit tricky because they want to have a picture of the whole country, right? So you just get information about everything that everyone consumes on average. And the problem is the average because the majority of the population is not even close to that number. So for someone like a 5 rand increase in groceries means you have to stop eating something or choosing between food or choosing between transport to your work, right? Whereas, like, if I'm in the high income bracket and I do my groceries in Woolworths, 5 rands, they're not going to feel it because proportionally to their income, that inflation is negligible. So that's one of the issues that is happening there in terms of, like, how you have, like, people really and severely affected by inflation. And this is, like, something that is happening globally, like these tensions about food prices, and this comes related with what happened after the pandemic and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that is basically brought the cereals really high up into prices, and that's central to most of people's diets all over the world. So that has made, like, really, really, like, difficult the space to be able to afford groceries, right? So one way of doing it is let's think about like something that the FAO has, that is a food inflation index, and that gives you a better sense of what people can afford. Right? Because if you're seeing, like, the trend is increasing, the cereals are increasing, the bread is increasing, the milk is increasing 10%, and your salary is increasing 5.5, that means you have to try to figure out what to do with the 4.5 rands of shortfall that you have.
Yeah.
And that's key because it's pushing more people into trying to fix this through debt just to maintain the levels of consumption. And this is not like conspicuous consumption. This is just your food. And put them in a poverty trap. Some figures talked about, like, more of 50% of South Africans being indebted, like negative wealth. So you owe more than what you actually have. So the question is, how do we allow people to start to build wealth in the lower income so they can create their own businesses and their own assets, so they can, like, figure out ways of creating and moving the economy, right?
Yeah. And I looked at a couple of countries to try and understand, can poverty ever be reduced, and what does that look like? Because given where we are at in our conversation, it would appear that austerity coupled with inflation targeting, coupled with a capitalist system that is obsessed with maintaining a status quo where there's a high Gini coefficient, which is a mechanism used to mathematically determine the levels of inequality that we have in this country, but we don't quite need mathematics to do so. We can simply look at one part of Hout Bay, how that looks, and how the other parts of Hout Bay looks, where Masipo Malele and others, these very, economically insecure South Africans that is in such high majority. And as you say, when you do take the current approach and things cost R5 more, for the person that's not going to Woolies, that R5 is between going to a job, buying electricity, buying bread, that sort of thing. And this is the stuff I hear daily from people, even on the Cape Flats. When you go to a spaza shop and you can buy a packet of coffee, in a small little plastic bag, because that's what they can only just afford, buying one toilet roll at a time. This is the daily lived reality of very many Cape Townians and South Africans. And so then in understanding what fixing poverty looks like, aside from using grants, for instance, as we're talking now through the Sol Plaaitjie University researchers and economists that are suggesting using grants in a more productive way to generate economic performance. I had to look at some other countries where poverty has been reduced. We look at Brazil, for instance, the infamous Lula moment, referring there to, of course, Lula da Silva, the president that, of course, did in some way use a cash transfer program like Bolsa Familia, which was very similar to a grant system. India used also, a social grant system in some way or the other to lift quite a number of people that were in entrenched deep poverty. Vietnam, focused on exports, so beneficiation, local production with a view to beneficiate, and then also export was a key factor there. And of course, the main country that I think everyone points to, the case study, is China. And the key thing about China is beyond, I think there's still high levels of inequality, there's still a low wage yield, there's still slave-like labor conditions in certain factories, etc. But the reality is that the evidence points out to, in the last, 20 to 30 years, China has lifted something like 800 million people out of poverty. You sit with scenarios in which the targeted approach was to, relocate people from inhospitable areas, so like we have townships. That is what Xi Jinping's government had done. They had job placement programs, they had educational support, and then fundamental to their growth was infrastructural development. And I hear in this country constant talk about the necessity to invest in infrastructure, though the evidence of it is falling so dismally short. And so given these examples that we can point to, case studies that we can look towards, why do you think there is such a apathetic approach to really getting on with investing in infrastructure, generating jobs, creating local industries with a view to export, and not be reliant every time when there is a temperamental president in Washington wanting to slap on tariffs, and then we make a big noise about the impact of jobs, because multinational companies that have set up here to produce cars are now going to have to look at different ways to export products from this country, for instance. That it seems that we're stuck in the reverse gear at the moment when we look at other options on how to alleviate poverty.
I think because of the problem is not only economic, it's political as well. So it depends how the political system responds to the needs of the people, right? So like on the one hand, we have to figure out how to mobilize the economies to reduce poverty. Like let's think about the case of Brazil and Lula. And like several countries have managed to do that because the extra money allows people just to try to figure out how to invest and do the best for themselves. I mean, there's this kind of like also this vision, almost like a nefarious vision of what people in precariousness are going to do with the money. And the reality is more like the majority of the times, and this is like proved by research left, right, and center, people make smart choices. They put money for schooling. They put money for trying to open a business. They try to make things to make their lives better. So that's one vehicle. But that cannot happen magically in the absence of public services. Public services is an extremely important vehicle that allows people to break poverty. If I'm living in the township and I have to figure out between buying food for my baby and going to the doctor to check this pain that I have in my stomach, that's already a bad trade-off. We need to allow people to take care of themselves in a wholesome way. And public services do that because then, as citizens, we don't have to worry about either making the choice between eating or going to the doctor. And you can do both. And that's not obnoxious. That's decent. And I think like that's something that we need to break in the public discourse. Because unfortunately, and this is not like just a South African feature, because the globe has become so unequal. Talking about the well-being of people that are receiving less money becomes almost like if you're like doing some sort of conspiracy. but we're talking about human beings. We're talking about our own humanity and the respect of their human rights, right? That's one element of the picture. And for that, education, health, transportation, security as public services that we can have are enablers for a lot of things. Because if you have security, then you can get like a night shift. And then you're not worried when you come back to the township that something is going to happen to you when you come from work. And then you can try to like hustle a little bit more and try to get more money to see if you can send your kid to learn like maths or something, you know. So that enables people because the state is actually giving people the space to do stuff in other dimensions like the grants, right? The issue when we check like the models of like, let's say China, is that they have managed to do that. And they have been quite successful at it. At the cost of being able to be a democratic society. And with the experience of a country like South Africa, like the hope whenever we talk about these governments doing these investments and like the benefactor authoritarian regime is that they got a good authoritarian guy. But if we get a bad one, it can be really, really bad. And it has happened. And you were talking about the president like in the US. So like it can go bad. The US is currently committing suicide, despite that they're a democracy because they got a bad president. So the importance of the capacity to have like power accountable is extremely important to be able to build societies. And the value of South Africa is that South Africa shows that you could hold power accountable. Apartheid was thrown away, political apartheid. Now you need to throw it's like socio-economic apartheid. And that still requires mobilization. And that still requires telling people like, look, you know what? Austerity doesn't work if we don't have public services. Yes, do austerity with the Blue Light Brigade. That's fine. People would come and invest in the country.
Yeah, we're going to be wrapping up very shortly with Fabio Andrés Diaz Pabón. Of course, he's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Southern African Labour and Development Research Unit. Of course, he's talking to us about, this concept. Of course, he's also at the African Centre for Excellence for Inequality Research at the University of Cape Town. And we're talking about a poverty problem and scratching our heads, trying to have an academic understanding of the problem, because as you may recall all of this week, we've been complaining and lamenting and dealing and fighting and grappling with this idea of just how expensive life is and municipal bills that we spoke about this morning and electricity prices, but then also coupled with gang violence. And this morning a story we covered where 60 kids died in like 2 months on the Cape Flats. And it's just, these are all somehow interconnected. And this is the academic part of our conversation that we're trying to understand how to get on with fixing these perennial legacy issues, but also the legacy that we are building at the moment, which as it stands, looks pretty grim in terms of affordability, whether your kid that's growing up in today's economy will be able to afford a house in future, it remains a question mark. I want to, Fabio, maybe just a round off with looking at, I suppose all of those in context. I look at what's happening at the moment with, that regime that you say is committing suicide in the United States, and the fight with Venezuela, and claiming that it's about drugs, but perhaps it's got a little bit to do with a disputed region there, to the south of Venezuela that's got oil and blah blah blah, that sort of thing. I know that's a part of our conversation, but of course also. I think your roots, being Colombian, etc., if I understand that correctly, that I've been looking particularly at some Latin American countries and looked myself at some of the deep levels of poverty that we see in those countries as well. I've, for the longest time, believed that apartheid spatial planning is one of the core issues at play, and I do still think it is. But when I look at, for instance, at the design of the Cape Flats, and when I look at some of those very high-rise flats in places like Colombia and elsewhere, Latin America, etc., you know this all too well. I mean, I look at very similar circumstance. I look at poverty. I look at the way people live. I look at the lack of options available. Yet in South Africa, the problems seem a lot more bigger than even what those countries are grappling with. And in some of those countries, we're looking at even population numbers much bigger than South Africa's. But crime is particularly out of control. Poverty is particularly entrenched. And then you sit with, again, that mathematical exercise called the Gini coefficient that increasingly shows, that the inequality levels in South Africa is at the most alarming highest rates that you can find comparable to elsewhere in the world. And so I want to look at why it appears, at least as a Cape Townian, as a South African, why this problem is of a very intense nature in this part of the world comparable to our counterparts elsewhere.
Well, I think there's different elements. One of the elements is like in the case of the history of Latin America, like independence happened 200 years ago. So in that sense, like as independent countries, Latin American countries are a little bit older. So that allows to like institutions to learn and improve things, right? Also, like I think in the case of Latin America, the political systems have always had more than one party. So not this party state, not this liberation party that happened a couple of hundred years ago, right? So that allows a little bit of political competition, so people can like try to offer things. So you, for example, if you think like you mentioned the case of Brazil, you had Lula, then you had like Bolsonaro, extremely right-wing president, and then you have the left. So there's this capacity of the political system to respond and change. You know what I mean? So that allows to correct for some of the mistakes that might happen. Or for example, what you can see like now in Argentina with President Milei, extremely right-wing, but like most likely he's gonna come out in the next term because people will like notice what they do and they can kick them out. So that helps, but that's not enough, right? So what has happened in Latin America is like since the 90s, this is fairly recent. They started to have like public registries and like social grants. The grants in Latin America are not that old, like 30 years old. But they have been building that process slowly and growing the number of people that are getting grants. So I can tell you, like from the case of Colombia, initially the grants were like 2 to 3 million people. Now they're reaching out like something like 18 to 20 million people. That is similar to the numbers of South Africa. And that has allowed the capacity to people to find ways in which they can mobilize and try to break poverty in addition to public services. So it's not just the grants will fix everything. We need grants that enable a context in which people can grow out of poverty. That's one element. The other element is like the way we understand poverty. We usually tend to measure poverty by an income indicator, let's say a number of dollars per day, whatever. But what that showed is that in the context of the pandemic, and this is Latin America and all over the world, we thought we had less people living under poverty. And what we realized is like a lot of people is living under precarious situations and circumstances. So people someone might be able to have a cell phone, but they might not be able to buy groceries for the next month if something happens to their job. So there's a lot of people at the edge. So that shows the problem of poverty and how to break poverty beyond the incomes. And I think for that, thinking about assets and the capacity to either create a small business, buy a cow or a goat if I'm in a rural area, trying to get like some sort of extra income is an important way to first dynamize the economy and second allow people to exercise their agency, right? Which I think like this is something that is more likely to happen in Latin American or African context. I think like in the case of South Africa, there's this peculiar feature of the bylaws. If you go to Latin America, you see like a lot of people selling vegetables in the streets. You don't see that in Cape Town. So like even when people try, the municipality is not enabling them to try to make business, because that's kind of like a catch-22 because you're saying like, we're not growing. Yes, but you're not allowing people to grow. You're a helicopter parent that doesn't allow people to grow. So people need to be allowed to take their own agency. And for that, we need to figure out a way of doing this in a context in which it is important to have security. You cannot have an economy without security. What we're seeing now, for example, you mentioned the case of Venezuela, a country that imploded in the last 2 decades, or the violence in Latin America, Ecuador, with like migration of people walking from Ecuador to the US because of violence. So you need like state capacity to give security. So I go and I buy something in the corner shop and nothing is going to happen to me. That predictability is important for any society to grow. You cannot have that in any society and have a growing economy, right? And then the public services. So people have like a fallout option, a backup option, sorry.
Yeah, we hope that somewhere, somehow, we get to the bottom of these issues. And I mean, even with a national dialogue underway at the moment, do conversations like this find place there? And are the policymakers listening? Are they willing to change direction? And given the fragility of our political system at the moment, it's very difficult to say, even in the next election, which party will be the dominant party. The DA, in some respects, seems to have reached their ceiling, though there is a possibility where a middle-class base could force them over the line if increasingly, poor people are becoming disenfranchised to the point where they don't longer want to participate in a system that doesn't serve them. Why should they care? Why should they go and vote when this is their everyday life? And voting hasn't materially moved things for them. And then a party that does support, social grants like the ANC does and has, interesting ways within which to get us out of this problem, doesn't have the political will to be able to get on with fixing the problem. And then they do such a poor job at even, reticulating something as simple as water in parts of Joburg. And so this is, again, just the fragility of the system that we have right now. And I don't know how best to conclude this conversation other than to say that some very simple but ingenious ways are going to have to be required to get us out of the path that we're on at the moment, because where we're heading does seem pretty much disastrous. But hey, as Fabio says, Latin American countries had 200 years to, that they've received, they were freed from colonization. We're only just 30 years into that journey. Let's see, perhaps, whether we need a little bit more time to get us there. But at the moment, again, we're not even talking about how to get there. And I think that is where the problem in part lies. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. Fabio Andrés Diaz Pabón, he is an academic. He's a senior researcher at the African Center for Excellence for Inequality Research at the University of Cape Town. He holds several other hats. And I'm certain you will agree with me that was as depressing as the topic is, but it was a very useful conversation to understand the state of our economic affairs.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.